In the previous couple of videos, we talked about how we can convert Markdown into HTML, and we created a couple of functions to do exactly that. But when we try to use those functions in a front-end application in a use effect which runs when all the page is loaded, basically, we ran into an error which looked like this. So why is this error happening, and how does Next.js provide us with like the Node.js APIs in the first place? We'll try to discuss that and then fix this particular issue. To understand how Next.js works, or rather how it is allowing us to use the Node.js APIs, we have to first understand exactly what Next.js is. So if we look at the diagram that I just created, at the bottom is the CPU, your computer. And above that is the node environment which is running on that particular CPU, which is written in C++ if you don't know that. And then on top of this node environment, there is this Next. What is Next? In layman's terms, Next is just a compiler which takes in some code and generates HTML out of it. And not only HTML, it also generates serverless functions which runs on Node.js. This Next server also in itself runs on this node environment. If we look over to our package.json file, you will see that to start a development server, we run next dev. Next is a command that runs on the terminal, and this command accesses the node environment to do all of the things that we need from Next. So we as a developer can only talk with the Next API or Next.js framework. We don't have a direct access to the node environment. This is the abstraction layer that Next.js provides us, which gives us all the benefits that we have discussed in the prior videos, like static generated files, server side rendered pages, search engine optimization, etc. Although this abstraction comes at a cost that we can't directly access the node environment, we have to go through Next.js to access the node environment. And Next.js has provided us with some standard things that we can use to access the node environment. That is why when we try to run this piece of code on our front end in this use effect, it doesn't work. Because this is not how Next.js wants us to do things. Because there is a standard API for doing the backend code on the front end. Because we are not directly accessing the node environment, we have to go through Next, the framework, to access the node environment. And you can't just do anything. You have to go through a certain set of instructions that Next.js has provided us to access those that node environment, those library functions that are present in Node.js itself. For example, file system that we are using right here. Now, what has Next.js provided us with to solve this issue, to run some code on the backend on a front end page? It has provided us with two functions, get server side props and get static props. Let me just implement those real quick and then we can discuss how they are working. So if you look at the screen, there is a function called get server side props, which is exported. Now everything inside this function is executed on the server. This is the thing that Next.js gives us, through which we can execute backend code on our front end. It doesn't execute on the front end, it is executing on the backend only. But this function has allowed us to actually do stuff on a front end that will be executed on the backend. It will not be shipped to the client. This will be on the backend itself, but we can use it on a front-end code itself. So if we look inside the body of this function, I have created a variable named all post data, which stores whatever is returned through the get sorted post data function, which, as we discussed, is an array of objects. Now if I console log this all post data, I think we should see an array of objects. But first we will have to comment this out. So as you can see, the error has been resolved, right? Now if I open the console, I should see a array of objects, but we are not seeing it on the client side because Because this function body is being executed on the backend. And what do we mean by the backend? The node environment which is being executed on the CPU. And where are we accessing that node environment? Next.js is accessing that node environment, right? And where are we using Next.js? We are using Next.js to create a development server on our terminal. If you look onto the screen, we will see an array of objects console logged on the terminal, because this is the backend, this is the client, right? That is why we can't see the array of objects here, but we can see it here because this is the backend. So if we go back to our diagram, what we are essentially doing is, us developers have sent a request to the to Next.js through that get server side props function to execute some code on the backend. Now Next.js will process this request and then send the code to the server, the node environment, not the server, the node environment where the server is present exactly. That is why the console logged data is being console logged on the terminal where it is being accessed. The node environment is being accessed. I hope this makes sense. Okay, so I hope you understand that how the backend code is being executed through our front end. But now the question arises that how can I get this data on my function that is being exported or rather rendered on the client side? Because even though this code is in the same file, this function is not being executed on the client. This is being executed on the backend server, and this function is being executed on the client. So how can we take this data and render it on the client? Well, it is extremely easy thanks to Next.js. If we look over to this function, we have returned an object in which props key has also an object which has the all post data array. Now to access this all post data, all we have to do is accept some props in this default exported function which is being rendered on the client. So if I write here props and try to destructure these props, right? So what I will get is all post data from these props. Now what I can do is, in this use effect, I can console log this all post data. If I go over to our client, as we can see, we have the array of objects on our client also. And this is how the backend code is rendered on the backend and the front-end code is rendered on the front end, even though both of them are in the same file. This is how powerful Next.js really is. Next.js also provides us with another function that allows us to execute this code on the backend, and that function is called get static props, which is extremely similar to this get server side props. Let me just comment this out and then implement the get static path version of the same code. As you can see on my screen, I have implemented the same function, but the name of the function is different. Instead of get server side props, the name of this function is get static props. Now if I go over to the website, it is doing the exact same thing, giving us the array of objects of the blog's metadata. Then what is the difference between these functions? The difference between get server side props and get static props is get static props generates the HTML on build time, making our website statically generated. What that means is, whenever a client goes to an URL that is served by Next.js, they will get the HTML directly instead of going in the rendering phase. What server-side rendering does is, instead of doing the rendering on the client side, it does the rendering on the server side. So conventionally in React, whenever we do something on the front end, it is re-rendering on the client's computer. For example, if you have your mom's phone which is like 5 years old, the React website will be a lot slower on that device because the processor of that device is slow. But server side rendered applications will be comparable in speed in a good phone and a bad phone, because the rendering is happening on the back end, which is same for both of the devices. Now in statically generated websites, the rendering does not even happen because the HTML is already been generated when the website was being built. So there is no rendering happening after we have deployed our application. Even if your mom opens that site or you open your site on your good phone, the speed will be pretty much the same because only HTML is being served on both of those phones. No JavaScript is shipped until and unless it is required, because there is no re-rendering happen on the client side. That is why on my website, if we go over to my actual website, changing the pages are extremely fast because there is nothing being re-rendered. It is HTML that has already been generated and is stored in a server, and the server sends this HTML without doing any processing. It just sends the HTML via the HTTP protocol. Now, for example, if I open a blog, it is instantaneous because it is just HTML. There is no rendering or re-rendering happen. This is how Next.js allows us to create server-side rendered and statically generated websites. This has been like server-side rendering and static generation in Next.js, and how are we able to execute backend code on the front-end framework, which is Next.js. In the next video, we will like try to render our blogs that we just like created with those functions, because now we are able to execute those functions on a front end. So see you in the next video.